The courtroom in Caldwell, Kansas smelled like sawdust, tobacco smoke, and desperation, and Mamie Morgan had not slept in 36 hours. She stood at the front of that cramped, sweltering room with her leather satchel pressed against her ribs, her dark hair pinned back under a practical felt hat, and her eyes fixed on the man seated across the aisle who had spent the last 3 weeks trying to destroy everything she had ever built. Reginald Crowe, soft hands, expensive suit, the kind of smile that lived comfortably in the shadows behind other people's misery, sat with his lawyer like a king at court, absolutely certain he had already won. And maybe he should have been certain. He had the judge's ear, or so the whisper in town said. He had 2 witnesses prepared to testify that Homer Ashford's mining claim on the north slope of Sentinel Ridge was fraudulent, that the ore pulled from that ground was salted, artificially enriched, and therefore the entire deed was built on deception. If Crowe won this case, Homer Ashford would lose not only the mining rights to a silver vein that would change his life, but the ranching land that bordered it, land his family had worked for 20 years. He would lose everything. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Percival Harmon, a thin man with white whiskers and the permanent expression of someone who had seen the worst of human nature, and found it unremarkable, settled himself behind the bench with the slow authority of a man who knew exactly how this day was supposed to go. Mamie felt Homer's eyes on her from the 3rd row of wooden benches. She had not looked at him since she walked in. She could not afford to. If she looked at him right now, with that careful, desperate hope he wore on his face like a wound, she would feel too much, and she needed every ounce of her mind to be exact and precise and utterly without emotion for the next 2 hours. She had the evidence. She had the science. What she did not yet know was whether science would be enough in a courtroom where money had been whispering through the walls for weeks. She had been called as an expert witness. She was 28 years old. She had spent 6 years running the assay office in Caldwell, and she was the only licensed assayer within 100 miles who was not in Reginald Crowe's pocket. That was why Homer had come to her 3 weeks ago with a canvas sack of ore samples, and eyes that told her he already half believed he was going to lose. That was why she had stayed up through a dozen nights with her furnace and her scales and her acid tests and her specific gravity measurements, and her careful, obsessive notes written in the cramped handwriting that her father had taught her back in Philadelphia before the consumption took him, and before she came west to make something of herself in a place where the rules were still being written. She had the truth. Now she needed the courtroom to receive it. But she had not anticipated that Crowe's lawyer would stand up in the first 5 minutes and move to have her testimony dismissed entirely on the grounds that she was a woman, and therefore not a credible scientific authority. The room buzzed. Homer Ashford was on his feet before the buzz had fully formed, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw set like granite, and the look on his face was the kind that made men in saloons reconsider their choices. "That is a vicious lie dressed in a suit," he said, loud enough to fill every corner of the room, "and every person in this county knows Mamie Morgan is the finest assayer in southeast Kansas." Judge Harmon banged his gavel. "Mr. Ashford, you will sit down." Homer sat, but his eyes were burning. Mamie took a long breath, straightened her spine, and prepared to fight. 3 weeks earlier, the morning Homer Ashford first walked through the door of her assay office, Mamie had been in the middle of a fire assay on a copper sample sent down from a prospector north of town, and she had not looked up when the bell above the door announced a new arrival. She had learned years ago that her concentration was a resource not to be wasted on formalities, and whoever stood waiting could wait another 2 minutes until she completed her fusion and made her measurement. "I heard you were the best," said a voice behind her, deep, unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned patience the hard way. "You heard correctly," she said without turning around. "Sit down. I will be with you in a moment." There was a short pause, and then the sound of a chair scraping against the wooden floor, and then silence, which she appreciated. Most men who walked through that door were incapable of silence. They filled it with nervous jokes or condescending questions, or the particular brand of fumbling awkwardness that men performed when they found themselves in a professional setting run by a woman and could not quite decide how to categorize the experience. This man simply waited. She completed her measurement, recorded the result in her ledger with the date and the sample number and the precise weight, and then she cleaned her hands on a cloth, turned around, and looked at Homer Ashford for the first time. He was tall, considerably taller than the door frame had expected of him, given the slight duck he must have made coming in with dark hair that had grown a touch too long at the collar, and the kind of tan that came from years of outdoor work rather than an afternoon in the sun. His hands, resting on his knees while he waited, were large and scarred in the particular way of men who worked hard land. He wore a plain canvas jacket over a dark shirt, functional riding boots, and a hat he had removed and was holding with a quiet respect that she noted and filed away. He was perhaps 32 or 33. His eyes, when they met hers, were a calm and watchful gray-blue, and they held neither condescension nor performance. He was simply looking at her, taking in what was there, and waiting to understand the situation on its own terms. "Homer Ashford," he said, standing when she turned, which was another thing she noted. "Mamie Morgan, what do you have for me?" He reached into the canvas sack he had set beside the chair and placed 6 ore samples on the front edge of her desk with a careful deliberateness that told her he had handled them with awareness of their importance. They were rough, heavy, irregular pieces of rock, gray-white with veining that caught the morning light from her east window in a way that made her lean forward instinctively. "These are from a claim I filed 4 months ago on the north slope of Sentinel Ridge," he said. 72 acres. There is a vein running northwest to southeast approximately 40 feet below the current surface that I have been developing for the last 3 months. And you need them assayed for silver content. I need them assayed for silver content, yes, but more than that, I need documentation that proves these samples are authentic. There is a man named Reginald Crow who is contesting my claim in Sedgwick County Court. He is saying my ore is salted." Mamie looked up from the samples. "Salted ore is a serious accusation." "It is a lie," Homer said, and the steadiness with which he said it was not the steadiness of someone performing innocence. It was the steadiness of a man stating a fact he knew as well as he knew his own name. "I have never salted anything in my life. My father raised me to be honest about the land and everything it gives, and I am not about to dishonor that because some Eastern speculator with a lawyer thinks he can take what I built." Mamie studied him for a moment. She had heard similar speeches before men with secrets they had not quite buried deeply enough, rehearsing their innocence in the hopes that saying it firmly enough made it true. But Homer Ashford's eyes did not shift. His breathing did not change. His hands resting on his thighs were completely still. "I will need 2 weeks," she said. "Minimum. I will run fire assays, specific gravity tests, acid tests, and a spectral analysis if the results suggest it is warranted. My fee is $4 for the initial battery of tests plus an additional $2 for written documentation suitable for court presentation." "Done," he said without hesitation. "I should tell you clearly, Mr. Ashford, that my findings will be reported accurately regardless of what they show. If I find evidence of salting, I will say so in my report and I will testify to it." "That is exactly why I came to you," he said, "because I was told you tell the truth." She picked up the first of the samples and turned it in the light, examining the grain structure and the color distribution of the metallic veining. Already something in the sample's character was telling her a story, though she kept her expression neutral. Good science did not run ahead of its evidence. "I will have preliminary results in 5 days," she said. "Come back Thursday morning." He put on his hat, nodded once, that economical nod of a man who did not require reassurance, and walked back out through her door. Mamie stood for a long moment in the quiet of her shop, holding one of his ore samples in both hands, feeling its weight and its texture, and the particular sense that the next 2 weeks were going to matter considerably more than most. She was right about that. The next 5 days were consumed by the particular deep pleasure of rigorous investigation. Mamie had always loved this part of her work most. The way a good scientific question settled over her mind like a second skin, the way it organized every thought and directed every observation toward a single precise purpose. She had learned her trade from her father, Dr. Charles Morgan, who had been a chemist and mineralogist in Philadelphia, and who had believed, with a certainty unusual for his era, that his daughter's mind was as fine an instrument as any he possessed. He had taught her chemistry and metallurgy and precise measurement with the same seriousness he applied to teaching her brother. And when he died and her brother took a position in New York, and the family's small savings dissolved into the costs of illness and burial, Mamie had taken what her father had given her. The knowledge, the instruments, the relentless precision, packed it into 2 trunks, and headed west to a place where her skills were desperately needed, and where, she hoped, the absence of established hierarchies might mean she could build something purely on the quality of her work. She had been right about that too, mostly. Caldwell in 1882 was not Philadelphia. It was rough and loud and occasionally violent, and there were men who walked through her door every week who could not quite believe she was the person they needed to speak to. But the ore did not lie, and the assay reports did not lie, and over 6 years she had built a reputation that was the most valuable thing she owned. Miners and ranchers and speculators came to her from 3 counties because her numbers were exact and her word was iron. She ran Homer Ashford's first fire assay on a Tuesday evening, alone in her shop after she had locked the front door and lit the good oil lamp, and set the furnace to temperature with the particular care of someone handling something important. A fire assay for silver required a precise flux mixture litharge, soda ash, borax, flour, combined with the powdered ore sample and fused at high temperature to produce a lead button that collected the precious metal. The button was then cupelled, oxidizing the lead away and leaving a pure bead of silver and any gold that might be present, which was then weighed to a precision of hundredths of a grain. What she found on the first assay was a silver content of 412 ounces per ton. She sat with that number for a full minute before she wrote it down. 412 ounces per ton was an exceptional result. It was not impossible. The silver deposits of Kansas had produced remarkable concentrations in some locations, but it was the kind of number that immediately raised a question, because it was also close to the kind of number that a man salting his ore samples might reach for, trying to make his claim look valuable enough to attract buyers or to justify a legal claim to a property someone else wanted. She ran the assay again. Same result within 3 ounces per ton, which was within her normal tolerance. Then she did something that most assayers in the field did not bother with, because it required additional equipment and time and knowledge that not everyone possessed. She examined the specific gravity of the ore matrix itself, the non-metallic host rock, to determine whether the silver mineralization was consistent with natural formation, or whether it had been introduced artificially. Naturally occurring silver in a native ore deposit showed a characteristic distribution pattern in the host rock, with mineralization following fracture lines and crystalline boundaries in a way that was extraordinarily difficult to replicate artificially. Salted ore that had been artificially enriched by adding silver salts or silver-bearing solutions tended to show a different distribution, with the silver concentrated on exterior surfaces or in patterns that followed the path of a liquid rather than the path of geological formation over millions of years. Mamie spent 2 full days examining the fracture patterns under her loupe, making careful drawings of the distribution patterns in each of Homer's 6 samples, comparing them against the reference plates in the geology texts her father had left her, and against her own notes from previous assays. What she found was unambiguous. The silver in Homer Ashford's ore followed deep fracture lines and crystal boundaries in a pattern entirely consistent with a natural silver deposit formed by hydrothermal processes over an extended geological period. There was no surface concentration. There was no evidence of introduced silver salts. The mineralization was as natural as the sky. She felt a quiet, precise satisfaction settle through her, the satisfaction not of a desired outcome confirmed, but of truth found. On Thursday morning, when the bell above her door announced his arrival, she was ready. Homer Ashford came in wearing a different shirt, dark blue, clean, with the same worn canvas jacket over it, and the same watchful eyes. He took the chair she indicated without being asked, and he waited while she opened her ledger to the pages where she had recorded her preliminary results. "I have completed the first round of testing," she said. "I have run 2 fire assays on each of your 6 samples, confirmed specific gravity measurements, and begun a detailed examination of the mineralization distribution in the host rock." "And," he said, she met his eyes, "your ore is natural, Mr. Ashford, unambiguously so. The silver content is consistent across all 6 samples, ranging from 398 to 422 ounces per ton, which is a statistically narrow and internally coherent range entirely consistent with a homogeneous natural deposit. The distribution patterns I have observed are characteristic of hydrothermal silver mineralization. They are not consistent with artificial enrichment." Homer Ashford let out a breath he had clearly been holding for a long time. It was not a dramatic breath. It did not shake or break, but it was the breath of a man who had been carrying a weight and had just felt it shift. "I still have 1 more week of work to do," Mamie said carefully, "and I want to run 2 additional analyses before I produce my final written report, but I want you to know where the evidence points." "I appreciate that," he said very quietly. She looked back at her ledger. "There is 1 more thing. I want to see the site itself. If Crow's lawyers are going to challenge my findings in court, and they will, I need to be able to speak to the geological context of the deposit as well as the chemistry. I need to see the vein, the host rock formation, the excavation. If you are willing, I would like to ride out to Sentinel Ridge before the end of next week." Homer looked at her with an expression that shifted in a way she found difficult to categorize: surprise, yes, but also something that sat behind the surprise, something quieter and more complicated. "Most Assayers don't go into the field," he said. "I am not most Assayers," she said. That was where the slight curve appeared at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, too controlled for that, but the suggestion of one. "No," he said. "I am beginning to understand that." They rode out to Sentinel Ridge the following Saturday. Setting out from Caldwell in the early morning before the heat of the June day had built itself to its full intensity. Mamie wore her practical riding skirt and her boots and a light canvas duster, with her satchel of instruments strapped across her back. Homer rode a large, dark bay gelding named Garrison that moved with a sureness and quietness that told her the horse had been well trained and was well loved. He had offered to hire a second horse for her, but she had brought her own, a solid gray mare named Geometry, which made Homer look at her briefly when she introduced the animal, and this time she did allow herself a small smile. The ride to Sentinel Ridge took the better part of 2 hours, following a trail that wound out of the flat grassland south of town and up into the broken, rocky terrain of the ridge country, where the geology of the region showed its bones. Mamie found herself noticing the way Homer moved through the landscape, not with the careless self-possession of a man who owned the world and expected it to accommodate him, but with a quieter attention, a constant small awareness of the terrain and the weather and the horses and the route, the kind of attention that came from years of responsible relationship with a specific piece of land. He did not try to fill the ride with conversation, which she appreciated, but neither was the silence uncomfortable. He pointed out a distant dust column that might be weather moving down from the northwest, and she agreed it likely was. He observed that the ridge country's upper formations were limestone rather than sandstone, and she agreed, and noted that limestone host rock was consistent with certain types of hydrothermal silver deposition. He nodded with genuine attention rather than the glazed politeness most people applied when she spoke technically. "Your father was a mining man?" she asked, when the silence had rested comfortably between them long enough to hold a question. "Rancher," he said. "My father came out from Missouri in 1858 with 60 head of cattle and 2 horses and a determination that would have impressed most mules. He built Ashford Ranch from nothing, literally from grassland and stubbornness. He died 4 years ago." He paused. He knew the ridge country was worth something. Used to say the rocks up there had the look of money in them, but he never had the time or the tools to prove it. "So you are proving it for him?" Homer was quiet for a moment. "I am proving it for all of it, for the ranch, for the land, for what he built, but yes, for him too." Mamie understood that kind of dedication. She had her own version of it, though she did not say so then. When they reached the north slope of Sentinel Ridge and Homer dismounted and led her to the excavation, a careful, shored timber entry descending into a narrow working drift that he had cut following the strike of the vein. She pulled her lamp from her satchel and climbed down into the earth without hesitation. Homer followed her, watching as she moved along the exposed face of the vein with her loop, her small geological hammer, and the focused intensity of a woman entirely in her element. The vein was wide and well-defined, cutting through a matrix of limestone and chert, and the silver mineralization was visible even in the lamplight. Native silver in dendritic forms, acanthite, argentite, the classic mineralogy of a genuine hydrothermal silver deposit. She spent an hour underground, taking new samples from 2 additional points along the vein's exposed face, noting the structural geology, making detailed sketches in her field notebook. Homer held the lamp for her when she needed both hands, passed her tools when she indicated them, and otherwise stayed quiet and observant in a way that made him extraordinarily easy to work with. When she finally climbed back out into the afternoon sun and straightened her back and took a long breath of open air, she became aware that Homer was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "You love this," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again there was something in his voice she could not quite name, a quality of genuine attention that felt different from admiration, which could be patronizing, and different from surprise, which was often insulting. It was something more like recognition. "I grew up around men who worked the land and the rock and the ore," he said, "and I have never once seen anyone move through a working drift the way you just did, with that kind of authority, like you and the rock were speaking to each other." Mamie looked at him. "We were," she said, and then, because she trusted honest conversation with people who could receive it, "The rock has a great deal to say if you know how to listen." Homer Ashford nodded slowly, and she had the distinct impression that he was not simply acknowledging the remark but genuinely receiving it, turning it over in his mind and finding it interesting. That was the moment, she would think later, when she began to feel something more complicated than professional interest. She did not act on it. She had work to do, and the work came first, and the work was urgent. When she returned to Caldwell that evening and spread her new field samples across her work table alongside the original 6, the picture they together painted was comprehensively unambiguous. The deposit on Sentinel Ridge was natural, substantial, and exactly what Homer Ashford claimed it was. What she did not know yet, but discovered 3 days later when her friend Clara Deming, who worked at the town's land records office and had eyes that missed nothing, came to find her with a carefully folded piece of paper and an expression of barely contained fury, was that Reginald Crowe had already moved to bribe the one other Assayer in the region, a man named Frederick Holt who worked out of Wichita, to produce a competing report claiming the ore was salted. "He is going to present it in court," Clara said, pressing the paper into Mamie's hands. It was a draft letter, obtained through circumstances Clara declined to specify, from Holt's office to Crow's attorney. He has paid Holt $200 to provide false testimony. Mamie read the letter twice. Then she set it down very carefully on her desk and stared at the wall for a moment. $200 was a significant sum. Holt's testimony, if delivered with professional confidence, would carry weight. And if the judge was sympathetic to Crow, as the whisper in town had long suggested, then even a credible competing report could be enough to cast sufficient doubt on Homer's claim to swing a ruling against him. This was no longer a simple assay job. This was a deliberate, coordinated assault on truth, and it was going to require everything she had. She spent the next 4 days preparing a case file that she was fairly confident was the most thorough piece of scientific documentation she had ever produced. She organized her fire assay results into a systematic table showing all 12 individual assays across all 8 samples, with mean values, standard deviations, and confidence intervals. She wrote a detailed technical explanation of her specific gravity methodology and its application to the question of natural versus artificial mineralization. She included her field drawings of the vein's structural geology, with annotations keyed to the relevant sections of the geological literature. She wrote a clear, precise explanation, calibrated for a non-specialist reader, of why the distribution pattern she had observed could not have resulted from salting, with reference to the specific physical and chemical processes that would have had to occur. And she prepared, very carefully, for the likelihood that Frederick Holt's false testimony would make certain specific claims she anticipated based on what a minimally competent assayer trying to fake a damning report would likely assert. And she constructed, for each anticipated claim, a precise and technically devastating rebuttal. When Homer came to her office the day before the court date, she showed him all of it, spreading the documents across her desk and walking him through each section. He sat across from her in the late afternoon light, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, reading her analysis with a concentration and seriousness that she found, to her own surprise, deeply moving. Not because he was impressed, though she could see that he was, but because of the quality of his attention. He read carefully. He asked intelligent questions. When she explained the specific gravity methodology, he asked her to slow down and explain the principle underlying it, and when she did, he absorbed the explanation and nodded and asked a follow-up question that demonstrated genuine understanding. "You built this in 4 days," he said, looking up from the case file. 3.5, she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Mamie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name without the formality of address, and the sound of it in his voice was entirely different from when clients generally addressed her with this name. "I want you to know that whatever happens in that courtroom tomorrow, regardless of the outcome, what you have done here, what you have built from nothing in 3.5 days because you cared about the truth, I will not forget it." She met his eyes and felt the particular electric difficulty of not looking away. "The truth is the only client I work for," she said. "You just happen to be telling it." "I know," he said. "That is the thing about you, isn't it? You would have done this even if the evidence had gone the other way." "Yes," she said, "I would have." He nodded slowly, and there was something in the quality of his regard, careful, complete, fully directed, that made her feel, in a way she generally worked very hard to avoid, as though she were entirely visible. Not in a way that was alarming. In a way that was, quietly and somewhat inconveniently, wonderful. She gathered her documents and told him she would see him at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he said he would be there, and he put on his hat and went out through her door, and she stood for a long time in the evening quiet of her shop, listening to the sound of Garrison's hooves fading down the street, and did not try too hard to analyze what she was feeling. She was in court the next morning at 7:45. The courtroom was already filling when she arrived, which told her this case had attracted more attention than a routine mining dispute typically would. Caldwell was a town built on the cattle trade primarily, but it sat in a region where the land itself held secrets, and the question of who owned what ground, and what that ground was worth, was never far from the surface of any conversation. Reginald Crowe was known in 4 counties as a man with Eastern capital and Western ambitions, and the particular conviction that the law was a mechanism to be operated rather than observed, and there were plenty of people who had their own reasons to watch him face a challenge. Homer was already there when she arrived, seated in the 3rd row of the gallery, in his clean dark blue shirt with a jacket that fit him somewhat better than the canvas one he usually wore. He saw her and stood, which she noticed, and she gave him a nod that she hoped conveyed confidence she felt, but was disciplined enough not to perform. Crowe arrived a few minutes later with his attorney, a man from Wichita named Harlan Peck, who had the professional smoothness of someone who had successfully bent the truth in enough courtrooms to have stopped worrying about the friction. Behind them came Frederick Holt, a portly, pink-faced man in a brown suit who could not quite look directly at anything, which Mamie catalogued and filed away. Judge Harmon took his seat, and the proceedings began, and everything moved with the heavy deliberateness of official process for the first 40 minutes, while the particulars of the claim, the deed, and the filing dates were established and entered into the record. Then Harlan Peck stood and delivered his opening argument, which was polished and fluent and built around the narrative of a simple, hard-working Kansas rancher who had been deceived by a fraudulent mining claim and was seeking justice. The narrative's architecture required a villain, and it cast Homer Ashford in that role with the confident ease of someone who had dressed honest men in those clothes many times before. The salted ore, Peck argued, was the centerpiece of a deliberate scheme to inflate the value of the Sentinel Ridge property and make it look like something it was not. Mamie listened carefully and noted every specific claim, checking them against her preparation. Peck's case was built on 3 technical assertions: that the silver content was anomalously high, that the distribution of mineralization was inconsistent with natural formation, and that certain trace element ratios in the ore were characteristic of artificially introduced silver rather than native deposit silver. The 3rd point was the most sophisticated, and she felt a cold alertness move through her when she heard it, because it was a technical argument that would require a detailed response. Then Peck moved to have her testimony excluded on the grounds of her gender, and the room buzzed, and Homer stood and said what he said, and Judge Harmon restored order. Mamie let the moment settle, and then she stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor," she said, in the clear, carrying voice she used when she needed a room to listen, "I hold a certificate of competency in assaying and metallurgical analysis from the Colorado School of Mines Correspondence Program, completed in 1876. I have operated the licensed assay office in Caldwell since 1878. In that time, I have produced reports for over 400 individual clients, including testimony in 3 prior Sedgwick County proceedings, in all of which my analysis was accepted and my credentials were not challenged. I respectfully submit that the objection to my testimony is without technical merit and that it represents a strategic attempt to remove inconvenient evidence from the record." The room was very quiet. Judge Harmon looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not entirely read. Then he looked at Harlan Peck. "Objection overruled," he said. "The witness will be permitted to testify." From the corner of her eye, Mamie saw Reginald Crowe's expression shift fractionally, a barely visible tightening around the eyes that told her exactly how much he had been counting on that exclusion. Frederick Holt testified first, and his testimony was competently delivered if internally inconsistent in ways that Mamie documented quietly in her notepad as he spoke. He asserted that the silver content in Homer's ore was too high to be naturally occurring in Kansas limestone host rock, that the distribution patterns suggested surface enrichment, and that trace element ratios were not characteristic of the regional geology. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had memorized his lines, but his eyes never fully settled, and twice he used phrasing that suggested he was reciting rather than reasoning. When Mamie's turn came, she walked to the front of the courtroom with her case file and the composed certainty of someone who had prepared for exactly this. She began with the fire assay results. She presented each of the 12 individual tests, explained her methodology in clear language, walked through the statistical analysis, and stated her results. The silver content of 412 ounces per ton was high but not impossible. She presented documentary evidence of comparable natural deposits in similar geological settings, citing published records from the USGS survey of 1879 and the Geological Survey of the Kansas Formation conducted by Professor E.L. Howarth, whose work she had both read and corresponded with. Then she addressed Holt's claim about distribution patterns, and here she produced her field drawings careful, detailed, to scale, and explained what they showed. She explained what natural hydrothermal mineralization looked like, what artificial enrichment looked like, and why the patterns she had documented in Homer Ashford's ore were unambiguously of the former type. She used language precise enough to be technically unassailable, but clear enough that every person in the room who was paying attention could follow the argument. Then she turned to the trace element ratios, and this was where she had prepared most carefully, because this was where Holt's false testimony was most dangerously sophisticated. Mr. Holt has asserted, she said, addressing Judge Harmon directly, that the ratio of antimony to silver in the ore samples is inconsistent with naturally occurring silver in Kansas limestone formations. I would like to address this claim precisely. She laid out the relevant data. The antimony to silver ratio in Homer's samples was 1:147. Holt had claimed this ratio was characteristic of silver carbonate solution used in salting rather than native silver. But he had made two specific errors that any genuinely qualified assayer would not have made. First, Mamie said, and her voice in that stuffy, crowded courtroom was as steady as the truth, Mr. Holt's claimed reference value for Kansas limestone native silver 1:300 is not drawn from any published geological survey. There is no such published value. I have searched the relevant literature comprehensively. The actual range documented in the nearest comparable geological studies is 1:100 to 1:200, within which Homer Ashford's ore falls precisely. A murmur ran through the room. Second, she continued, Mr. Holt has claimed that silver carbonate solution used in artificial enrichment produces antimony ratios characteristic of the range I have described. This is incorrect. Silver carbonate solution used in salting produces negligible antimony content because the antimony in native silver ore derives from the specific geological conditions of its formation and is not present in commercially available silver compounds. A ratio of 1:147 antimony to silver, therefore, does not indicate artificial enrichment. It indicates a natural ore that formed in conditions consistent with the geological profile of Sentinel Ridge. The silence in the room had changed quality. It was the silence of people concentrating hard. I have brought documentary support for both of these statements, Mamie said, placing 2 pages on the clerk's table, consisting of excerpts from the 1879 USGS Geological Survey report on Kansas and southeastern Colorado silver deposits, with the relevant passages marked. Judge Harmon leaned forward and examined the documents. His expression remained neutral, but she saw his reading slow down when he reached the marked passage, which meant he was absorbing it. Harlan Peck rose for cross-examination with the expression of a man making a rapid tactical adjustment. He challenged her on her credentials, and she met each challenge with a precise, documented response. He challenged her on her sample selection methodology, and she walked through her collection procedure in such detail that the challenge dissolved. He tried to suggest that she had a personal stake in the outcome, which was both the most dangerous and the most desperate of his moves. "Do you have a personal or financial relationship with Mr. Ashford?" Peck asked, and he put a particular inflection on it that was designed to imply something more complicated than it stated. "I have a professional relationship with Mr. Ashford," Mamie said clearly. "He is my client. I have been paid $6 for my analysis work, which is my standard fee. I have no financial stake in the outcome of his claim." "And a personal relationship," Peck pressed. "I have met Mr. Ashford on 3 occasions," Mamie said, "in the course of completing the professional work for which he engaged me." She was aware, without looking, that Homer was in his chair in the 3rd row, absolutely still. "And your findings," Peck said, shifting his angle, "conveniently support your client's position in every respect." "My findings report what the evidence shows," Mamie said. "That they support my client's position is a consequence of the fact that my client's position is correct, not a consequence of any bias on my part. I would refer the court's attention to the first page of my report, where I have explicitly stated that I informed Mr. Ashford prior to beginning my analysis that my findings would be reported accurately regardless of their direction. He accepted that condition. That is the basis on which I conduct all my work." Peck sat down. Frederick Holt was recalled briefly for redirect, and he attempted to shore up his trace element argument, but Mamie had done her work too thoroughly. When his own attorney asked him to explain the basis for his reference value of 1/300, Holt hesitated for just a fraction of a second too long, and then said he had derived it from his own practical experience, and Mamie felt the case shift in that moment the way a rock face shifts before it falls, not dramatically, not with noise, but with the absolute certainty of physics obeying itself. Judge Harmon recessed for 30 minutes to review the documentary evidence. Mamie sat in a hard wooden chair in the narrow hallway outside the courtroom, her case file on her lap, and breathed carefully. She had done everything she could do. The evidence was sound. The argument was sound. The rest was out of her hands. She heard footsteps, and then Homer Ashford sat down in the chair beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the close air of the hallway. "I have never watched anything like that in my life," he said, very quietly. She looked at him. His expression was doing several things at once, and all of them were genuine. There was the residual tension of a man who had just watched his entire future argued over in public. There was something that looked like relief, though he was clearly disciplining himself not to assume too much yet. And there was the thing she had first noticed in his eyes on the north slope of Sentinel Ridge, that quality of complete and serious attention, directed at her with a warmth that was entirely unmistakable. "I just told the truth clearly," she said. "You built a case out of science and documentation and logic that dismantled a lawyer and a bought Assayer in front of a courtroom full of people," he said. "I watched every person in that room go from uncertain to convinced. I watched you do that in 45 minutes. She was quiet for a moment. "The truth has good bones," she said. "It holds up under weight." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "it does." They sat in the silence of the hallway for another 20 minutes, neither of them speaking, and the silence was not empty but full of things that were moving slowly toward the surface and had not yet arrived. When the bailiff appeared to call them back in, they stood, and as they did, Homer's hand brushed briefly against hers, not quite an accident, not quite intentional, just the proximity of two people who had been sitting side by side in a narrow hallway waiting for something important, and had found the closeness natural rather than uncomfortable. Neither of them said anything about it. They walked back into the courtroom together. Judge Harmon returned, settled himself, and opened his ruling notes. The ruling was precise and unambiguous. The court found that the documentary and scientific evidence presented by the plaintiff's expert witness was substantively more credible than the expert testimony presented by the defendant's witness. The specific reference to the documented USGS survey, data versus the unsubstantiated claims of the opposing expert was noted explicitly. The contested mining claim on the north slope of Sentinel Ridge was confirmed as legitimately filed and legally held by Homer Ashford. Reginald Crow's contest was dismissed. All costs of the proceeding were assigned to the defendant. The room broke into noise. Not wild noise, this was a courtroom, and Judge Harmon was still in his seat, but the particular release of tension that sounds like a collective exhale made audible. Mamie was already gathering her documents when she felt a hand on her arm, and she turned, and Homer Ashford was standing very close to her with an expression that had finally let go of all its careful discipline and was showing her everything it had been holding back. "Mamie," he said. "Don't you dare cry," she said, and immediately felt her own face doing something she was not entirely in control of, which was deeply annoying and also impossible to stop. He laughed, a real laugh, quiet and surprised, not the polite kind, and the sound of it was something she knew immediately she wanted to hear again. "I was not going to cry," he said, though his voice was slightly rough. "Good," she said, and finished putting the last document in her satchel and snapped the clasp shut, and then looked at him because she could not think of any reason not to. "Your ore was pure," she said simply. "I told you what I found." "You did a great deal more than that," he said, and he held her gaze with the steady, complete attention she had come to understand was simply the way Homer Ashford engaged with things that mattered to him. "I wonder if you might allow me to buy you dinner this evening, in gratitude, and because I would very much like to talk to you about something that has nothing to do with assay reports." She looked at him. Her heart was doing something entirely undisciplined. "I would like that," she said. Reginald Crow swept out of the courtroom before the ruling had fully settled, his attorney behind him and his expression wearing the particular fury of a man whose certainty of owning everything has met an unexpected limit. He did not look at Homer, and he did not look at Mamie, and she noted his departure with the alert awareness that a man like Crow did not simply absorb a loss and recalibrate. He was the kind of man who looked for another angle. She was right to note it. 3 days later, she came to her shop in the morning to find that someone had broken the front glass of her assay office window in the night, not a brick, nothing so crude, but a rock placed with deliberate accuracy that left a single, clean circular hole surrounded by radiating cracks. It was a message, not a full action. It was Crow saying, "I know where you are." She swept up the glass herself, had the window repaired by the end of the day, and told no one about it except Homer, who came to town that afternoon because he had heard from Clara Deming, who had a talent for knowing things before most people knew them. He stood in her doorway and looked at the new glass and looked at her, and the muscle in his jaw was working in a way that suggested significant self-restraint. "He is angry," Mamie said calmly. "He thought he owned this outcome." "He cannot threaten you," Homer said, and his voice had a quality she had not heard before, very level, very controlled, and beneath the control something that was not anger exactly but was its serious and purposeful cousin. "He did not technically threaten me," Mamie said. "He threw a rock through my window in the dark, which is the action of a man who does not know how else to speak. I am going to speak to Marshal Hennessy." "I have already spoken to Marshal Hennessy," Mamie said. "I filed a report this morning." She paused. "Homer, I appreciate your concern, but I have been managing difficult men since I was 22 years old. A broken window does not frighten me." "It tells me I won, which I already knew." Homer looked at her for a long moment. His expression moved through several things: the protective instinct, which she could see, and then the recognition that she was not asking for protection, and then the genuine respect that recognized the difference, and then something warmer and quieter that settled behind all of it. "All right," he said, "but I am going to speak to Hennessy anyway, on my own account. Crow does not only have a grievance against you. He lost $60,000 in potential silver revenue and a legal case in the same morning." "That is fair," she said. "Come in and have coffee." He came in and had coffee, and they sat at her work table with the afternoon light coming in through the new glass and talked for 2 hours. and it was the kind of conversation she had not had since her father died, wide-ranging and honest, and shot through with genuine mutual interest in the other person's mind. He told her about his father and the ranch, and the 2 years of drought that had nearly broken the land in the mid-70s. She told him about Philadelphia and the chemistry laboratory, and arriving in Caldwell at 22 with 2 trunks and a portable furnace, and the absolute intention of being useful. He told her about the first time he had seen the Sentinel Ridge vein, how the lamplight had caught the silver veining, and he had stood for a long minute just looking at it, feeling something that he had not been able to name properly, which turned out to be the feeling of a future arriving. "I know that feeling," she said. "Do you?" He was looking at her the way he had looked at the silver vein, and she was almost certain he was aware of the parallel. "I had it the morning I opened this office for the first time," she said, meeting his gaze directly, because she was not a woman who looked away from things. "I had it again recently." He was quiet for a moment, and the quality of the quiet was the quality of something being very carefully held. "When?" he asked. "The morning you walked through my door with those ore samples," she said, which was true, and she said it because she had decided, somewhere in the previous 2 hours, that honesty was both her professional practice and her personal one, and there was no reason to apply a different standard to this. Homer set down his coffee cup with a deliberateness that was entirely conscious. "Mamie," he said. "Don't say something you are not ready to mean," she said. "I have been thinking clearly about what I mean since approximately the moment you told me to sit down and wait while you finished your fire assay," he said, and the slight wryness in his voice was entirely genuine. "I am perhaps not the most immediately articulate man on the frontier, but I know what I know." She looked at him. "And what do you know?" "I know that you are the most remarkable person I have met in 33 years, he said simply, without decoration or performance. "I know that watching you dismantle Crow's case in that courtroom was the most impressive thing I have ever seen, and I was not even surprised, because I had already understood what kind of mind you had. I know that I would like to earn the right to spend considerably more time in your company." The afternoon light was very gentle in the room. Outside, Caldwell moved through its ordinary afternoon business, and none of it touched the particular quality of this moment. "You do not need to earn it," she said. "Just continue being worth the time." He reached across the table and his hand covered hers, and she let it, and the warmth of his palm against the back of her hand was exactly what she had expected it to be, solid and genuine, and entirely without pretense. They began spending time together with the straightforward intention of 2 people who knew their own minds. He rode into Caldwell on Thursday and Saturday afternoons when the ranch work permitted, and they took their evening meal together at the hotel dining room, or at Mrs. Haverson's boarding house kitchen, when Mrs. Haverson decided they were her personal project, and took to feeding them both with a generosity that left no room for objection. They went to church on Sundays, sitting together in the 3rd row with a naturalness that the rest of the congregation accepted and approved of, with the speed that small Western towns approved of things that made sense. He read the geological texts she lent him with genuine interest and asked her questions that she answered at length, and she discovered that he had a mind for systems, for the way things connected, and the way one condition led to another. That made him an excellent conversation partner on almost any technical subject. She read the livestock management papers he brought her from the Kansas City Agricultural Journal, and found herself genuinely interested in the science of range management and soil health, which led to 2 very long conversations about the chemical composition of prairie soils that left them both energized and slightly amazed by each other. She met Garrison, his horse, formally, and the horse accepted her with a suspicion that gradually transformed into something like respect, which Homer said was the highest endorsement Garrison had ever given anyone. She told him about her mother, still living in Philadelphia with her aunts, whom she wrote to every month and visited every year or 2, and who had accepted her daughter's Western life with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. He told her about his younger sister, Frances, who had married a farmer in Abilene and had 2 young children and came to visit the ranch in August every year and was, he said with obvious affection, the most opinionated person he had ever met before Mamie. "Am I opinionated?" Mamie asked. "You have strong and precisely reasoned positions on nearly every subject," he said. "I find it one of the most attractive things about you." She laughed, which she was doing more often than she had in years, and he looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as his particular look, the one that was not quite a smile but was everything that lived behind a smile. The trouble with Crow did not end with the broken window. 3 weeks after the trial, Marshal Hennessy arrested Frederick Holt on charges of providing false testimony, based substantially on the contradictions between Holt's court statements and the documented evidence Mamie had presented. Holt, facing a criminal charge he had clearly not been promised protection against, named Crow as the source of his payment and the direction of his false report. Crow's lawyers attempted to suppress Holt's statement, but the damage was done. Crow himself left Caldwell in October 1882, with several pending legal matters following him east, and the general consensus of the town was that his departure improved the air quality considerably. On a Thursday evening in late September, after supper at Mrs. Haverson's, Homer and Mamie walked together along the main street of Caldwell in the cooling evening air, the sky above them going from deep orange to purple in the western way that always made her feel like the world was being remade fresh. He was holding her hand, which had become natural enough to be unremarkable between them. "I would like to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "Then ask it." He stopped walking and turned to face her, and in the violet evening light his expression was completely open, none of the usual careful discipline, all of the genuine feeling that lived behind it fully present. "I am aware that you have built something here entirely your own," he said. "The office, the practice, the reputation. I am aware that you came west alone and built it from nothing and that it belongs to you and to no one else. I am not asking you to give any of it up." He paused. "I am asking you to let me be part of your life alongside it. I am asking you to marry me." The evening held its breath. At least, it felt to Mamie as though it did. She looked at him for a long moment, at the open, serious face, at the steady gray-blue eyes, at the man who had waited while she finished her fire assay and held the lamp for her underground and read her father's geology books and sat beside her in a courthouse hallway and never once asked her to be smaller than she was. "Yes," she said, "on the condition that you understand what you are agreeing to." "Tell me," he said. "I will keep the assay office," she said. "I will continue to take clients and produce reports and testify when I am called. I will not disappear into the ranch. I am a scientist and I am a professional, and that is not going to change." "I know," he said with complete certainty. "I have never wanted you to change a single thing. I want the whole of you, Mamie. The science and the fire assays and the geological arguments and the way you talk to rocks and all of it. That is what I am asking to be beside." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, feeling the warmth of his skin in the evening air, and he turned his face slightly into her touch, and she understood that this was a man who was not afraid of being cared for. "Then yes," she said again, "absolutely yes." He pulled her close and kissed her with a tenderness that was also completely sincere, and the Kansas evening continued its business of remaking the sky, indifferent to them in the best possible way. The way the world is indifferent to happiness, which means it does not interfere with it. They were married in November 1882 in the First Methodist Church of Caldwell, on a cold, bright day when the wind came down from the north and made everyone's cheeks red, and the church interior feel warm in contrast, lit with candles and the particular glow of an occasion that the town had decided to attend in full. Clara Deming stood with Mamie. Homer's friend James Calloway, who ran the neighboring ranch and had known Homer since boyhood, stood beside him. The minister said the words and they said the words back, And the moment Homer put the ring on Mamie's finger, she felt something settle in her. Not a completion, because she had never been incomplete, but an addition, a wholeness of a different kind, the kind that comes from choosing to join your life with someone who sees you clearly and wants exactly what they see. They had a supper in the hotel dining room that evening with 30 of the townspeople, and Clara gave a speech that made Mamie both laugh and work hard to keep her eyes dry. And James Calloway told a story about Homer at 16 that Homer endured with remarkable grace. And Mrs. Haverson fed everyone until they could not stand and declared it the finest wedding supper she had ever provided, which everyone accepted as entirely likely. They went to the ranch that night, Mamie for the first time as its co-owner, and stood together on the front porch in the cold dark looking out at the land, the wide grass, the distant shape of Sentinel Ridge against the stars, the particular quiet of a place that had been tended for 20 years by a man who understood what it meant to care for something. "This is yours too," Homer said. She looked out at the silver-dark land. "I know," she said, and she did. The first winter of their marriage was the kind that tested everything. A series of blizzards came down from the north in January that kept the ranch in a state of constant alert, with Homer spending long cold days checking on cattle and reinforcing shelter, and Mamie managing the ranch accounts, organizing supplies, and riding out herself on the days when the weather permitted to help move livestock to the south pastures where the shelter was better. She discovered that she had a talent for the practical management of a ranch that surprised her slightly and delighted Homer a great deal. She also kept her assay office, riding into Caldwell 3 days a week through the winter, sometimes in weather that made the ride unpleasant and occasionally genuinely difficult. Homer worried, which she knew, and he managed the worry with the particular discipline of a man who had understood from the beginning that her freedom was not negotiable, and that worrying about it was simply a condition of their life together rather than a reason to restrict hers. "I can see the lamp in your office window from the ridge on clear nights," he told her one evening, when she came home later than expected from a complex analysis that had required an additional round of testing. "Can you?" she said. "Yes." "I check for it." She looked at him. "Homer." "I know," he said. "I am not complaining. I just wanted you to know I can see it." She went to him and put her arms around him and felt him hold her close with the particular quality of relief that was not possessive but simply glad, and she understood that this too was part of the whole of him she had agreed to, and found she did not mind it in the slightest. In March 1883, the first real silver production from the Sentinel Ridge mine began, with a crew of 4 men Homer had hired through the winter developing the drift and installing proper timber sets. The first clean crushed and smelted bar, weighing 14 pounds and assayed by Mamie herself to a purity of 94%, sat on the kitchen table one evening and they both looked at it for a long time. "Your father," Mamie said. "Yes," Homer said, and let the quiet hold it. The silver revenue began to change the character of the ranch in ways they had planned carefully together. Over the winter evenings, improvements to the cattle operation, additional acreage purchased along the eastern fence line, better equipment for the winter feeding program. Homer approached the mine's revenue with the same measured deliberateness he brought to everything, not spending ahead of production, not expanding beyond what the land and the work could sustain, reinvesting carefully. In April of 1883, Mamie told Homer she was expecting their first child. She told him early in the morning, before he had fully assembled his daily plans, in the kitchen with the coffee just made and the April light coming in clean and bright through the east window. He went very still for a moment, and then the expression that moved across his face was something she kept in her memory afterward like a pressed flower, pure and unguarded and completely joyful. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in both hands and kissed her forehead and her cheekbones and her mouth, and she laughed, and he laughed too, and for a while the coffee got cold. Their son was born in December 1883, healthy and loud, with Homer's gray eyes and Mamie's dark hair, on a cold, clear night when the stars over Kansas were extraordinarily bright. They named him Charles Arthur Ashford, Charles for Mamie's father, Arthur for Homer's. Dr. Whitfield, who had come out from Caldwell, declared him a fine specimen, and Clara Deming, who had driven out that morning on the strength of a premonition and stayed through the day and the evening, declared him the best-looking baby she had ever seen, which she said with a conviction that suggested she meant it. Homer held his son for the first time with the same careful, serious attention he brought to everything that mattered, and Mamie watched him from her pillow, tired to her bones and more content than she had words for, and thought that this was what it looked like when a good man's life expanded into what it was meant to hold. The ranch went through its ordinary seasons, the good summers and the hard winters, the calf crops and the hay harvests, the cattle drives to Abilene and the long, quiet months when the prairie went white, and the work was interior and deliberate. Charlie grew into a serious-eyed, curious child who followed his father through the corrals and his mother into her office with equal enthusiasm, and who, by the age of 3, had developed an intense interest in rocks that Mamie found both amusing and deeply gratifying. She continued to work. The assay office remained hers, and her reputation, if anything, had grown after the Crow case. The story of Mamie Morgan's court testimony had traveled through the mining and ranching communities of southeastern Kansas and had brought her clients from further distances, men who wanted analysis done right and had heard she was the one to go to. She hired a young assistant, a methodical and bright girl named Ruth Pierce, who came from a farm family north of town and who had the kind of precise, patient mind that made her excellent at the routine work and left Mamie freer for the complex cases. In 1885, when Charlie was 18 months old, Mamie and Homer went together to the Sentinel Ridge mine for the first time since their marriage, climbing down into the working drift to inspect the newest development of the vein, which had widened significantly with depth in a way the geology had predicted it would. They went alone with lamps, while James Calloway's wife minded Charlie for the afternoon, and they stood together in the rock-quiet underground, the lamplight catching the silver veining the way it had when Homer first found it, and Mamie felt the same thing she had felt that first time she climbed down here, the deep satisfaction of the earth showing its secrets to people patient enough to ask the right questions. "Same look on your face," Homer said. She turned to him. "Which look?" "The one you get when the rock is talking to you." She laughed softly, the sound carrying strangely in the confined space. "It has a lot to say today. The vein widens at depth, which means the thermal column that created this deposit was large and long-lived. There may be a secondary deposit below the main vein." Homer looked at the rock face with the expression of a man whose patience with long-term plans was essentially limitless. "How deep?" "I would want to run a survey before I speculate," she said, "but perhaps 40 feet below current working depth." "Tell me what you need and I will get it done," he said, because this was how they worked, her science, his capability, their shared willingness to do things right. She took his hand in the lamplight, underground in the rock, and felt the weight of silver all around them, natural, honest, won through patience and science and the refusal to back down when a man with expensive lawyers tried to take what was true and call it false. "I love you," she said. She said it easily, the way she said things that were simply accurate. "I love you," he said the same way. Completely. They stood there for a few more minutes in the good quiet of the mine, and then they climbed back out into the afternoon sun. Their second child, a daughter named Alina, arrived in 1886, and the event was somewhat less medically dramatic than Charlie's birth, though no less celebrated. Charlie, at 2.5, accepted his sister with a cautious initial inspection that concluded in approval, largely because Alina, from her very first week, showed a tendency to hold absolutely still and look at things very carefully before reacting to them, which Charlie found interesting. "She looks at things the way you do," Homer said, watching Alina watch the lamplight from her cradle. "Good," Mamie said. "That is either going to be a brilliant scientist or the most composed person in Kansas," he said. "Why not both?" Mamie said, and Homer laughed. The ranch in 1887 was something fundamentally different from what it had been 5 years before, not larger for the sake of being larger, but better in every meaningful sense. The cattle herd was healthier and better managed. The land had been properly fenced and managed. The old ranch house had been extended with 2 additional rooms, and the kitchen had been rebuilt to accommodate the particular reality that Mamie's work and Homer's work both generated paperwork that needed table space, which Mrs. Haverson, who visited monthly, declared was the most sensible ranch kitchen she had ever seen. The mine continued to produce steadily, well below the dramatic claims of the salting accusation, but solidly and consistently, the way genuine things produce, not in a burst, not in a dramatic rush, but in the patient accumulation of what is honestly there. Mamie received a letter in the summer of 1887 from Professor E. L. Howarth at the University of Kansas, who had been made aware of her analysis in the Ashford case and whose geological survey notes she had cited in her court testimony. He wrote to say that her trace element analysis methodology was the most rigorous he had seen applied to a practical field case in the region, and asked whether she would consider contributing a brief article to the Geological Survey's annual report on the methodology she had developed for distinguishing natural from artificially enriched silver ore. She wrote back immediately to say yes. The article was published in 1888 under the name Mamie Ashford, with a note that she was the proprietor of the Caldwell Assay Office and an independent geological analyst. Homer read the published version with an expression she knew well by now, the quiet, complete pride of a man whose happiness at another person's success was absolutely genuine and entirely without competition. "You are in the survey literature," he said. "Apparently," she said, trying to keep her voice steady and failing slightly. He set the report down and looked at her across the kitchen table, where Charlie was doing arithmetic on his slate and Alina was examining a piece of limestone Mamie had brought home for her, and said simply, "Your father would have been extraordinarily proud." She could not speak for a moment. When she could, she said, "Yes, I think he would have." They went on the way people go on who have built something real, through the ordinary days and the difficult seasons, and the moments of pure unexpected joy that punctuate a life and make its texture. Charlie, at 6, began to show a particular aptitude for mathematics that both his parents found delightful, and Mamie began teaching him chemistry at the kitchen table with the same patient rigor her father had used with her, though calibrated to 6-year-old attention spans, and supplemented with enough interesting explosions to maintain engagement. Alina grew into the composed, observant child Homer had predicted, with Mamie's dark hair and Homer's steady eyes, and an interest in the natural world that expressed itself in a collection of geological specimens that occupied an increasing amount of shelf space, and that she could name and describe with an accuracy that made visitors to the ranch blink. She was 4 years old and already had strong opinions about limestone formations. In the spring of 1889, Homer rode back from Abilene with the news that the Kansas legislature was considering a bill to establish formal licensing requirements for assay offices in the state, which included provisions for examination-based certification that would be required for anyone providing expert testimony in legal proceedings. He set the newspaper on Mamie's desk with a particular expression. She read the relevant section carefully. The proposed examination covered mineralogy, chemical analysis, fire assay methodology, and documentation standards. She looked up from the paper. "I could write the examination," she said. "I know," he said. "I thought the same thing." She wrote to the state's Mineral Survey Office and offered her assistance in developing the examination standards, citing her practice record and her published article. 3 months later, she received an invitation to serve on the examination committee. And in 1890, she traveled to Topeka for 2 weeks to work with the committee, a trip that she and Homer had prepared for with the logistical care of people who ran a complex operation and understood that its smooth functioning required planning rather than luck. She came back from Topeka with committee notes, 3 new geological contacts, and a particular energy that Homer recognized as the energy she had when something had gone exactly right. He met her at the Caldwell depot and took her bag and looked at her face and said, "Good trip." "Excellent trip," she said. "I put the trace element methodology into the examination standards." "Of course you did," he said, and the expression on his face was the one she loved best, the one that was not quite a smile and was everything behind a smile, directed at her with the complete, unself-conscious warmth of a man who was genuinely glad to be exactly where he was. She took his arm and they walked down the main street of Caldwell in the late afternoon sun, the same street she had walked alone for 6 years before he came through her door with a canvas sack of ore samples, and the patient, watchful eyes of a man who had not yet understood that the best thing that was ever going to happen to him was waiting to finish a fire assay. Charlie was at the ranch with James Calloway's family, and Alina was with Clara Deming, who had appointed herself the children's honorary aunt and managed the role with an authority that rivaled their actual parents. They had the evening, just the two of them, and they took its supper at the hotel dining room, the good wine that Homer had ordered from the distributor in Kansas City for special occasions, the comfortable, easy conversation of two people who had talked about nearly everything and had therefore stopped needing to perform for each other and could simply be. "I have been thinking," Homer said over the dessert course. "Should I be concerned?" she said. "No," he said. "I have been thinking about what we might do with the south pasture, where the drainage has never been quite right. There is a problem in the soil chemistry that I have not been able to solve." She looked at him. "Tell me what you know about it." He told her, and she listened and asked questions, and they were halfway through an analysis of soil mineral composition and its effect on grass establishment by the time the dessert plates were cleared and the dining room began to empty around them. The waiter, a young man new to the hotel, came to ask if they required anything further and found them deeply engaged in an argument about the calcium content of local water sources, and retreated quietly. And the night manager, who had been serving them for 7 years, looked over and smiled to himself and left them entirely undisturbed. Later, walking back through the night streets of Caldwell, Homer's arm around her shoulders and the stars enormous overhead, Mamie thought about the arc of the last 8 years. From the morning she arrived in this town alone with her furnace and her father's books, and the intention of being exactly what she was, to this. The work still before her, the family behind her, the man beside her who had never once asked her to choose between the truth and the life and who understood, with a completeness she had never expected to find, that for her the truth was always the life. She stopped walking and he stopped with her, and she looked up at the Kansas sky, immense and untroubled and scattered with more light than you could possibly count. "I want you to know something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "When you walked through my door with those ore samples," she said, "I knew they were genuine before I had run a single test. I could see it in the grain structure, the color distribution, the weight distribution. I knew the ore was pure." He looked at her. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because knowing is not the same as proving," she said, "and proving is the work." He considered this. "Is that a lesson about chemistry or about us?" "Both," she said, "always both." He smiled, a real, full smile, the kind she still found slightly startling in its completeness because he held it so rarely and spent it so precisely. "I love you, Mamie Ashford," he said. "I love you, Homer Ashford," she said. "And your ore is as pure as the day I first measured it." He laughed and she laughed with him, and the sound of it went out into the enormous Kansas night and dissipated into the dark the way honest things do, not disappearing, but becoming part of the air. They walked home through the quiet streets, past her assay office with its new glass window reflecting the moonlight, past the land records office where Clara Deming had once folded a letter that started everything, past the courthouse where the truth had been told to a judge who had, in the end, listened. Their life ran on ahead of them, wide and open and full of work worth doing, the mine and the ranch, and the children and the science and the long evenings at the kitchen table, and the seasons of Kansas that were never gentle but were always honest, which suited them both exactly. In 1891, a third child arrived, another son, born in late October on a day when the first hard frost of the autumn came down from the north, and the windows were frosted, and the ranch was settled deep into its winter preparations. They named him James Charles Ashford, James for Homer's oldest friend and Charles again for the grandfather he would never meet but whose influence was woven through the fabric of everything his daughter had built. Charlie, at 7, was delighted with a brother. Alina, at 5, was reserving judgment until she had gathered more data, which made both her parents laugh in the same moment and then look at each other with the particular helpless joy of parents who recognize their own children absolutely. Homer was 38 by then, with the first gray beginning to appear at his temples, and Mamie was 34, and they had been together long enough that the routines of their daily life had the warm, unhurried quality of things that know exactly what they are. They argued sometimes, with the honest directness of two people who valued truth too much to perform around it, and they resolved their arguments with the same directness, and they came out the other side each time with the ground a little clearer and the understanding a little deeper. He brought her coffee every morning before she had asked for it, and she kept a standing appointment every Thursday evening for the geological problem-solving sessions that had begun as the soil chemistry discussion, and had expanded into a regular meeting of what Homer had taken to calling, entirely without irony, the Sentinel Ridge Science Committee, which currently included Mamie, Homer, Charlie, and on alternate weeks, Professor Howarth's latest geological survey letters. The mine continued to produce. The ranch continued to grow in quality if not always in size. The assay office became, over the course of the 1890s, one of the most respected in the state, and the examination committee on which Mamie had served produced a certification standard that was eventually adopted by 3 neighboring states. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, November 1892, they sat on the front porch of the ranch house in the cold that was becoming familiar every year, wrapped against the weather, watching the distant shape of Sentinel Ridge against the last light in the western sky. Charlie was asleep inside. Alina had insisted on staying up to observe the stars, which Mamie had permitted on the grounds that it was scientifically reasonable, and she was currently in the east window with her face pressed against the cold glass. James, at 1 year old, was already asleep in his cradle. 10 years, Homer said. 10 years, Mamie agreed. You are exactly what you said you were, he said. She looked at him. What do you mean? When you told me on that first visit that your findings would be reported accurately regardless of what they showed, he said. That is what you have been every day, exactly what you said, accurate regardless. She considered this. Is that romantic? She said, with a slight amusement in her voice. It is the most romantic thing I know, he said, entirely seriously. She reached over and took his hand where it rested on his knee and held it, and they watched the last light go out of the western sky, and the stars come up over Sentinel Ridge, and the night settled over the Kansas prairie with the complete, unhurried authority of something that has been doing this for a very long time and intends to continue. Inside, Alina had apparently gotten the stars she was looking for, and had retreated to her bed without being told, which suggested she was her mother's daughter in more ways than the obvious ones. James slept on, new and untested and full of potential. Charlie was dreaming whatever serious, mathematical dreams occupied the minds of 7-year-old boys who had inherited their mother's precision and their father's patience. The ranch was quiet, and the mine was quiet, and Caldwell in the distance was its small, distant self against the dark, and the world had not grown smaller in 10 years. If anything, Mamie thought, it had grown precisely as large as the work they had done to fill it. "What do you want for the next 10 years?" Homer asked, the way he asked questions with real intention, wanting a real answer. She thought about it honestly. "More of this," she said. "The work and the science and the children getting bigger and stranger and more interesting. The ranch and the mine doing well. Mornings with good coffee. The occasional courtroom if the truth needs saying publicly." She paused. "You, all of it with you." Homer was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is exactly what I want." "Good," she said. "Then we are in agreement, which is the most solid basis for anything I know of." He pulled her closer, and she leaned against his shoulder. And the cold night was entirely comfortable in the way that being entirely in the right place at the right time, with the right person, makes cold nights comfortable, which is to say absolutely. The stars over Sentinel Ridge were extraordinary, and the silver was deep in the rock where it had always been, pure and patient, and exactly what it had always been, waiting for someone with the right knowledge and the right courage and the right refusal to back down when powerful men called the truth a lie. It had been there all along. It just needed the right person to prove it. Mamie Morgan Ashford, Assayer, scientist, wife, mother, and the finest geological analyst in southeastern Kansas, had done exactly that. And the ore was pure as it had ever been, as pure as everything that had come from knowing it.